There are betrayals that arrive like storms, loud and impossible to ignore, tearing through everything with violent clarity. And then there are betrayals that move in silence, shaping reality so subtly that by the time the truth is revealed, the damage has already taken root too deeply to undo. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, the most dangerous enemies are rarely the ones who stand openly in opposition. They are the ones who stand close enough to be trusted, who understand the emotional architecture of your life, and who know exactly which fears to awaken in order to control the choices you believe are your own. Ivy had never seen herself as a villain. That was the narrative she held on to, even as her actions began to cross lines she once believed she would never approach. In her mind, everything she did stemmed from protection, from a conviction that Elektra was heading toward a future that would ultimately destroy her. She watched Will with a critical eye, dissecting every decision he made, every hesitation, every moment where he failed to be the version of himself Elektra deserved. And the more she observed, the more her certainty hardened into something unshakable. Will was not just flawed, he was dangerous in ways that Elektra refused to see. What made Ivy's transformation so compelling was not its suddenness, but its gradual inevitability. She did not wake up one day and decide to manipulate reality. She convinced herself, step by step, that intervention was necessary, that inaction would be a greater betrayal than any lie she might construct. The problem with that kind of thinking is that it does not recognize boundaries. Once a person believes they are acting for the greater good, the definition of what is acceptable begins to expand. At first, Ivy's involvement remained within the realm of influence. Subtle conversations, carefully framed observations, suggestions planted at just the right moment to create doubt in Elektra's mind. She did not lie outright. She simply emphasized certain truths while omitting others, shaping perception without appearing to control it. But influence has limits, especially when it is competing with genuine emotion. Elektra's connection to Will, despite its complications, persisted. It bent under pressure, but it did not break. And that was when Ivy made the decision that would change everything. If Elektra could not be convinced to leave, then she would have to be removed. The plan did not emerge fully formed. It developed through a series of rationalizations, each one making the next step feel more justified, more necessary. Ivy told herself that distance would bring clarity, that removing Elektra from Will's immediate influence would allow her to see the relationship for what it truly was. But beneath that reasoning was something darker, something more controlling. Ivy did not just want Elektra to see the truth. She wanted to define it. The execution of the plan required precision. Elektra's disappearance could not feel forced. It had to appear voluntary, or at the very least, ambiguous enough to create uncertainty. Ivy understood the power of suggestion, the way people construct narratives when faced with incomplete information. So she began to build a situation in which Elektra's absence would not only seem plausible, but suspicious in a very specific direction. She isolated Elektra emotionally first. Through carefully timed conversations, Ivy amplified Elektra's existing doubts, her insecurities about her place in Will's life, her fear of being secondary to obligations she could not compete with. She presented herself as a confidant, someone who understood, someone who was trying to help. And in doing so, she gained Elektra's trust at the exact moment when that trust was most vulnerable. Then came the shift. Circumstances aligned in ways that felt coincidental but were anything but. A sudden opportunity, a reason for Elektra to leave Los Angeles, framed as a temporary escape, a chance to think, to breathe, to step away from the emotional chaos that had defined her recent life. Ivy encouraged it, supported it, made it feel like a decision Elektra was making for herself. And when Elektra finally left, believing she was taking control of her own narrative, she had no idea that she had just stepped into a reality that was no longer entirely her own. What followed was not immediate panic, but calculated escalation. Ivy did not announce Elektra's absence. She allowed it to be noticed, to raise questions organically. And when those questions began to form, she guided them, subtly at first, then with increasing intention. She introduced small inconsistencies, hints that something had gone wrong, that Electra had not simply left, but had been pushed, hurt, perhaps even endangered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, suspicion began to settle around Will. It did not take much. The history between them, the recent tension, the unresolved emotions, it all provided fertile ground for doubt. Ivy did not need to fabricate elaborate lies. She only needed to connect existing fears in a way that made them feel inevitable. A comment here, an observation there, a carefully placed detail that suggested Will had been the last person to see Electra before she left, that their final interaction had been more volatile than anyone realized. The narrative built itself. Will, already navigating the complexities of his life with Dylan and the weight of impending fatherhood, found himself pulled into a situation he could not fully understand. At first, he dismissed the concerns, convinced that Electra had simply needed space, that her departure was a continuation of the emotional distance she had already chosen. But as the questions grew louder, as the inconsistencies became harder to ignore, he began to feel something shift beneath his feet. Doubt, not in himself, but in the reality unfolding around him. Because the story being constructed did not align with his memory, with his understanding of what had happened between them. And yet, the more it was repeated, the more it was suggested, the harder it became to dismiss entirely. People looked at him differently. Conversations carried an undercurrent of suspicion, and for the first time, Will experienced what it meant to be seen not as a flawed man, but as a potential threat. Meanwhile, Electra, removed from the environment she believed she had chosen to leave, began to sense that something was wrong. Distance did not bring clarity. It brought disorientation. The space she had sought for reflection instead became a place of unease, where communication felt disrupted, where the connection she expected to maintain began to fray in ways she could not explain. Messages went unanswered. Calls did not reach their destination. Information felt filtered, incomplete. At first, she attributed it to coincidence, to the natural complications of stepping away from a chaotic situation. But as time passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She was not just distant. She was being isolated. The realization did not come easily. It required Electra to question the very person she had trusted most during her most vulnerable moments. Ivy had positioned herself as an ally, as a protector, as someone who understood her fears and wanted to shield her from further pain. To consider that Ivy might be the architect of her isolation required Electra to dismantle that entire perception, to accept that the person she confided in had been shaping her reality for reasons she did not fully understand. When the truth finally began to emerge, it did so with devastating clarity. Electra uncovered fragments first, small details that did not align, pieces of information that contradicted what she had been told. And as those fragments connected, as the full scope of Ivy's manipulation revealed itself, the emotional impact was overwhelming. This was not just interference. This was control. This was a deliberate attempt to remove her from her own life, to rewrite her story without her consent. And what made it unbearable was not just the betrayal, but its source. Ivy was not an outsider. She was family. The pain of that realization cut deeper than any romantic disappointment ever could. Will's choices, his flaws, his complications, all of that existed within the realm of emotional risk Electra had chosen to accept. But Ivy's actions violated something more fundamental. Trust, safety, the belief that the people closest to you operate within boundaries that cannot be crossed. And Ivy had crossed them without hesitation. When Electra returned to Los Angeles, she did not come back as the same person who had left. The uncertainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a clarity forged through betrayal. She no longer questioned her instincts. She no longer deferred to others' interpretations of her reality. What she carried now was knowledge, and with it, a determination that transformed her from someone reacting to circumstances into someone prepared to confront them. Ivy, for the first time, faced the consequences of her actions not as abstract risks, but as immediate, undeniable reality. The confrontation that followed was not explosive in the traditional sense. It did not rely on raised voices or dramatic declarations. It was something colder, more precise. Elektra did not need to accuse loudly. The truth itself was enough. Every detail she uncovered, every inconsistency she exposed, dismantled the narrative Ivy had constructed piece by piece. And Ivy, confronted with the full weight of what she had done, could no longer hide behind justification. Because in that moment, stripped of rationalization, her actions were undeniable. She had not protected Elektra. She had controlled her. She had not prevented harm. She had created it. For Will, the revelation was equally destabilizing. To realize that he had been positioned as a suspect, that his character had been quietly undermined by someone he had not even considered a threat, forced him to reevaluate everything. The confusion, the doubt, the shifting perceptions, all of it suddenly made sense, but that clarity came at a cost. It exposed how vulnerable he had been to manipulation, how easily his reality had been reshaped without his knowledge. And as the truth settled, the relationships between all three of them changed irrevocably. Elektra no longer saw Ivy as someone who could be trusted. That bond, once broken, could not be restored through apology or explanation. The betrayal was too deep, too deliberate. It had altered not just her circumstances, but her sense of self, her understanding of her own autonomy. Ivy, in turn, was left to confront the consequences of her belief that she knew what was best. Her intentions, whatever they had been, no longer mattered. What remained was the impact of her choices, the damage she had caused, the reality that in trying to control Elektra's life, she had lost her place in it. And Will, standing between them, found himself once again at the center of a conflict that was no longer just about love, but about truth, trust, and the right to define one's own life. Because in the end, the most devastating realization was not that Ivy had manipulated events. It was that she had succeeded. For a time, she had rewritten reality, reshaped perception, controlled outcomes in ways that felt absolute. And even though the truth had been revealed, even though Elektra had reclaimed her agency, the consequences of that manipulation could not simply be undone. Trust, once broken in that way, does not return easily. And as the dust began to settle, as each of them faced the aftermath of choices that had gone too far, one truth remained inescapable. Some betrayals do not just change relationships. They redefine them forever. There are dreams that do not arrive with spectacle, but with a quiet, fragile hope that settles gently into the spaces people are most afraid to believe in again. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, where love is often loud and betrayal even louder, the most devastating stories are sometimes the ones that begin in silence, in the soft promise of something finally going right. For Carter, a man so often defined by emotional intensity, by relationships that burned bright but rarely endured, the possibility of something steady, something real, had always felt just out of reach. And when that possibility finally appeared in the form of Daphne's quiet, trembling belief that she might be pregnant, it did not feel like drama. It felt like redemption. At first, it was disbelief. Daphne did not announce it with certainty, nor did she rush to celebrate. The suspicion itself felt too fragile, too sacred to expose to the harsh light of reality too quickly. She carried it carefully, testing it in her mind, replaying every sign, every subtle shift in her body, every moment that might point toward the truth she was almost afraid to acknowledge. For so long, her identity had been shaped by absence, by the quiet ache of something she could not have. To suddenly imagine a future where that absence was filled felt almost unreal, as if it might vanish the moment she spoke it aloud. When she finally told Carter, the moment did not explode with joy. It unfolded slowly, like something both of them were afraid to disturb. Carter's reaction was not immediate excitement, but something deeper, something more complicated. He had spent so much of his life navigating emotional extremes, love that demanded everything, loss that took more than it gave, that the idea of stability felt foreign. And yet, as the possibility settled into him, as he allowed himself to imagine what it would mean, something shifted. For the first time in a long while, his future did not feel like a series of reactions to circumstances beyond his control. It felt intentional. It felt chosen. They did not rush into celebration. Instead, they built the dream carefully, layer by layer, as if acknowledging it too loudly might break it. Conversations that had once been uncertain began to carry a new weight, a new direction. They spoke about a home, not just as a place they shared, but as a space that would grow, that would hold more than just the two of them. They imagined a child, not in abstract terms, but in specific, intimate ways, the sound of laughter in quiet rooms, the presence of something innocent and unbroken in a world that had often felt anything but. For Carter, this was more than just the idea of fatherhood. It was a chance to become someone different. He had always been a man who gave, who supported, who adapted to the needs of others. But this was something else entirely. This was not about reacting to someone else's emotional gravity. It was about building something from the ground up, something that would carry his influence, his presence, his identity in a way nothing else ever had. And in that realization, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Peace. But peace, in a world defined by instability, is often temporary. The first signs that something was wrong did not come with clarity. They came with hesitation, with small inconsistencies that did not align with the certainty they had begun to build. Daphne felt it before she could explain it, a subtle shift in the way her body responded, a quiet unease that she tried to dismiss. She told herself it was anxiety, that after everything she had been through, it was natural to feel uncertain, to question even the things she wanted most to be true. But uncertainty has a way of growing when it is not addressed. The doctor's appointment was supposed to confirm everything. Instead, it unraveled it. The moment the diagnosis was spoken, the world they had constructed together collapsed in a way that was both immediate and impossible to fully process. It was not just that Daphne was not pregnant. It was that the situation was far more serious than either of them had imagined. The symptoms she had interpreted as hope were, in fact, signs of something else entirely. Something that did not promise life, but threatened it. The words themselves did not register all at once. They arrived in fragments, in clinical language that struggled to contain the emotional weight of what it represented. A condition, a complication, a reality that required immediate attention, that carried risks, that introduced a future defined not by possibility, but by uncertainty and fear. For Daphne, the impact was devastating. The dream she had allowed herself to believe in was not just taken away. It was replaced with something darker, something that forced her to confront a reality she had not prepared for. The absence she had spent so long trying to overcome was no longer just emotional. It was physical, tangible, reinforced by a diagnosis that did not offer simple solutions. And beneath that, there was something even more painful, a sense of betrayal by her own body. Carter's reaction was different, but no less profound. Where Daphne collapsed inward, consumed by the loss of what could have been, Carter found himself struggling to process what remained. The shift from hope to fear was too abrupt, too extreme. One moment, he had been imagining a future filled with new beginnings. The next, he was faced with the possibility of losing something far more immediate, far more irreplaceable. Daphne, the emotional weight of that realization began to fracture him in ways he had not experienced before. This was not the familiar terrain of romantic conflict, of love tested by external pressures or internal doubt. This was something deeper, something that demanded a different kind of strength. And Carter, for all his emotional resilience, was not prepared for it, because this was not something he could fix. In the days that followed, the space between them changed. The intimacy they had built around shared hope was replaced by a quieter, more fragile connection, one shaped by fear and uncertainty. Conversations became careful, measured, as if both of them were trying to protect the other from the full weight of what they were feeling. Daphne withdrew, not out of distance, but out of need to process something that felt too overwhelming to share completely. Carter, in turn, found himself reaching for something he could not quite grasp. Control. He tried to be strong, to be present, to provide the kind of support he believed Daphne needed. But beneath that effort, there was a growing sense of helplessness, a realization that no amount of care or determination could change the reality they were facing. And for a man who had always defined himself through action, through his ability to respond, to adapt, to support, that helplessness was destabilizing. It began to manifest in subtle ways. Restlessness, irritability, a quiet frustration that had no clear outlet. And with that shift came vulnerability. Because when a person reaches the limits of their emotional capacity, they often look for escape, for something that offers clarity in a situation defined by uncertainty. For Carter, that escape did not come in the form of resolution. It came in the form of memory. Quinn, her name, did not enter his thoughts immediately. It lingered at the edges, a presence that grew stronger as his current reality became more difficult to navigate. Quinn represented a different version of himself, a time when emotions were intense but uncomplicated, when decisions were driven by instinct rather than responsibility. And in that contrast, she became something dangerous. Not because Carter wanted to return to the past, but because the past offered a kind of clarity that the present did not. Daphne sensed the shift before she could define it. Even in her own pain, even as she struggled with the weight of her diagnosis, she felt the subtle change in Carter's behavior. The way his attention fractured, the way his presence became less grounded, less certain. It was not a betrayal she could point to directly. It was something quieter, more insidious. Distance. And for Daphne, already grappling with the loss of the future she had imagined, that distance became another source of fear. Because if the diagnosis had taken away her dream of a family, Carter's emotional withdrawal threatened to take away the foundation she had left. The tension between them grew, not through confrontation, but through silence. Unspoken fears, unacknowledged doubts. And in that silence, the possibility of collapse became more real. Because tragedy does not always destroy relationships immediately. Sometimes, it erodes them slowly, creating cracks that widen over time until the structure can no longer hold. Carter stood at the center of that erosion, pulled between his desire to be present and his instinct to escape, between the man he wanted to be and the man he feared he was becoming. And the question that lingered, unspoken but unavoidable, was not whether he loved Daphne. It was whether he could withstand the weight of loving her through this. Because in a world where emotions often burn bright and fade quickly, this was something else entirely. This was endurance. And not everyone survives it without breaking. As the days turned into weeks, as the reality of Daphne's condition settled into something that could not be ignored or avoided, the path forward became less clear, not more. Choices that once seemed obvious now carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate relief. And for Carter, standing at the edge of a decision he was not yet ready to make, one truth began to take shape with quiet inevitability. This was not just a test of love. It was a test of identity. And the outcome would not simply determine the future of his relationship. It would define who he became.